Welcome again to Scientist Chat. This is our week 6 of what we've been doing here. Thank you very much for joining us again. As usual, just a few guidelines. Just a reminder that all attendees under the age of 13, that you need to have a parent or guardian present while you're attending this online chat. And I wanted to let everyone know once again that this session is being recorded. So, as you all may know, that we're doing this in support of the online Let's Talk Science Challenge, which is a weekly quiz. I apologize here, I have the incorrect quiz, so it'll be quiz number 6, which is tomorrow, which is Thursday the 21st. And as usual, we have both an English and French quiz available. So this week, it'll be focused around math. I know math is a topic that a lot of people enjoy. So some of the topics I'll be looking at include probability, encryption, and it's an interesting word, combinatorics. So let's take a look at the website. Combinatorics. So if we take a look at the probability, a lot of you may be familiar with what probability is. Things like heads or tails in coin flips, which is the example that they put here. And encryption, which a lot of you are very familiar with since we use a lot of online devices. Even the chat that we have here has some level of encryption taking place. So these just cover the mathematics behind encryptions. Okay. All right. Okay, so our guest today is Dr. Ashleigh Tuite. She's an assistant professor in epidemiology at the University of Toronto. She's an infectious disease epidemiologist and mathematical modeler, as well as a former soapbox science speaker. Her research interests include communicable disease epidemiology, mathematic modeling, and health economics. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ashleigh Tuite.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining. So I was going to start by talking a little bit about myself and my background, and I don't want to spend too much time on that because I know that there are some questions that people want to ask, and I think there'll be more questions hopefully after I tell you a little bit about my work. But I will start by sharing my screen. And let's go here. Okay, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself and how I got into what I do right now. So as I think probably many people, when I was little, I really was into space. And I remember my first real job that I wanted to be was an astronaut. I loved astronomy. I loved looking at the stars. I don't really know why I stopped wanting to be an astronaut. One thing that I do know is that I'm not particularly brave. So I don't think that I probably would have been very good had I been having to do the physical stuff that would be involved in going to space. And when I was in elementary school, I also was really into science. But the type of science that I liked was what was, I guess you would call a mad scientist. So I liked doing experiments with, making things, the idea of making things explode or doing stuff in the kitchen, like a volcano, using baking soda. I also was really interested in baking. And I think that baking is, a form of science. It's also, a form of math. If you think about it, when you're measuring things and you're, looking at, you use fractions to understand sort of how much of the different ingredients you need to add. So I guess I was always interested in science. But as I grew up and got older, I became interested in, I guess, different aspects of science. And so, whoops, hold on. Whoops, there we go. So when I went to university, I studied biochemistry. And the reason that I studied biochemistry was that, oops, sorry. Hold on a sec. Sorry, I think I have unmute. Let me put this back. Right, I think I have muted myself. Is that?
Sorry, Ashleigh, that was my mistake. You can keep going.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. So I studied biochemistry in university, and as part of that was, I studied biology, I studied chemistry, I studied a little bit of math and physics. But math was never really part of my, dream or career goal. It was something that I did because, I liked numbers and I needed to do it to get to where I wanted to go, but I never really considered it as a career path. I ended up after university, after my undergraduate, I ended up doing a master's degree in biochemistry. I worked in a lab for a few years and I did all sorts of research. And most of the work that I was doing was focused on infectious diseases. So we were trying to understand why certain people get infectious diseases and why other people don't. And the work that I was doing for my master's degree was using mice. So we were infecting mice with different diseases and trying to understand what were the aspects of their immune system that caused certain mice to get sick and certain mice not to get sick. I realized when I was doing the experiments that the part of science that I really, really loved was not so much the experiments. In particular, the work with animals used to make me actually pretty sad. I didn't like doing that work, but I found it really interesting at the end when you had your data and you could analyze it and start, thinking about, what do the results show us and how do we share that information more broadly with the world. And so I really liked what, in hindsight, I realized was sort of data analysis and looking at numbers and making graphs and stuff like that. So eventually what I did was, whoops, sorry about that, wrong way. I ended up going back to school. So I realized that the sort of stuff that I really like to do was part of a field of study that's called epidemiology. And I'm going to give you a definition of epidemiology in a moment. It's a long word and it sounds a little bit intimidating. But basically what it is it's the study of disease and health at the population level. So epidemiology is part of a field of study that's called public health. And so public health differs from what we typically think of when we talk about medicine because, typically if you're sick, you go to your healthcare provider, so you're a doctor or a nurse, and you show up and you tell them what's wrong with you and they hopefully try to help you get better. In public health, what we do is instead of thinking about individual people, we're looking at the health of the entire population. So, we're trying to prevent sickness and injury before it happens. So before you go to the doctor, we want to make sure that, the way that we live and the conditions that we live in are such that we can prevent you from ever having to go to the doctor. And so a way that you might think about this is, for example, if you were a doctor and you were seeing a lot of kids show up at your doctor's office with concussions because they're playing hockey and they're getting knocked on the head and they're getting concussions. What public health would do is instead of trying to treat those concussions, we would say, well, why are all of these children getting concussions? And say, well, maybe we need to think about how to protect people's heads. So maybe we'll get people to wear helmets. And so we're thinking a little bit upstream of what typical medicine is to try and prevent bad things from happening. So that's what the field that I got into. And so, I realize I'm talking today on the math session and you may be saying, well, where's the math here? You're talking a lot about science. And the reality is that math and science are really, really closely linked, and particularly in the field of study that I work in. So I specifically focus on studying infectious diseases and how infectious diseases spread in populations, and also thinking about how do we protect ourselves from infectious diseases. And I use a lot of math in my work. I use math in terms of counting, in terms of understanding, how many people are sick or how many people have risk factors for getting sick. And I also use math in another way, in something that's called mathematical modeling. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a second. Sorry, I keep forgetting. Here we go. So yeah, we already touched on this a little bit, but I just wanted to give you a more official explanation of what epidemiology is. So as I said, it's the study of how often diseases occur in different groups of people and why. So as I was talking about, I do something that's called mathematical modeling. And so that sounds pretty impressive, I think. You know, when I tell people I'm a mathematical modeler, they're like, oh, wow, you know, that sounds a little bit scary and intimidating. I was never really good at math at school and whatever. And the reality is that, you know, we all use models in our life. And so the type of models that I use involve using math and equations. But every day, you know, the way that we navigate the world, the way that we think about things, all of those involve models. So this is an example of a model. This is a man who has made a chocolate model of coronavirus. It's a representation, it's a simplified representation of something that's real. So this is not a real virus. It won't infect anybody, but it represents the key features of a virus. So it has, you know, the shape of the virus and the spikes on the virus. And so that's a model. You know, there are other types of models that we can use, whether they be something physical or something that's a little bit more abstract. This is something that you may have seen, you know, specifically as we are all thinking and talking a lot about coronavirus, there's been a lot of talk about flattening the curve. And the idea when we talk about flattening the curve is basically we have a new disease that's spreading in our population. And we know that lots of people will possibly get sick because it's a new disease, because we don't have a vaccine, because we don't have really good treatment for it. We want to try and prevent spread. And so what people in public health have done is they've come up with a model to try and think about how we can prevent people from getting sick. And they're, you know, what we call and what we talk about is flattening the curve. But effectively what this is we're saying, you know, we have this disease, we know it's going to spread. Let's think about things that we can do to try and slow how quickly it spreads in the population and prevent people from getting sick. And so again, this is a model. It's a way of explaining something so that people can understand it and help us understand why we're taking the actions that we're taking right now. So why are we all sitting at home? Why are we all, you know, prevented from, you know, hanging out with our friends? Why are we disrupting our lives? And so this is an example of a model that helps us understand why we're doing what we're doing. The type of models that I do are something that are called mathematical models. And so when I do models, there's math and there's equations. But it turns out that really all they are is that it's using math and formulas to explain how diseases move in populations. And it turns out that it's actually fairly straightforward. So you can make really, really complicated models. But a friend of mine has made this description of how a mathematical model works using emojis. And this is actually a really nice way, I think, of communicating how we think about diseases and how they spread in the population. So this is a non-emoji version of this same model. And basically what it's saying is that, you know, we start with our population and we haven't seen a disease before. So we all are potentially able to get infected. And then, you know, we can get infected if we interact with somebody who's sick, and eventually we recover. And it turns out that in between these different compartments here, you have some symbols and letters here, and that's where the math comes in. That really explains, you know, the rates at which we transition between these different stages of infection. And we also use probabilities to explain, you know, what's the probability of somebody getting infected. So there's math that underlies these, but the concepts are something that I think, you know, you don't necessarily need math to understand. So what I was hoping to do was just quickly explain something that you've probably heard a fair amount about, again, specifically related to coronavirus. And this is something called the basic reproduction number. And what this is and what this means is it's how many new cases an old case makes. So when you have an infectious disease, If somebody's infected, they can go on to infect other people. And each disease is a little bit different, and each disease has a different number. So in the case of COVID-19, we think that the number is around 2 or 3. So that means that for each initial case, so this is our initial infected person, they're going to make about 2 or 3 new infected people. And then each of those people are going to go on and make 2 to 3 new cases. Different diseases, as I said, have different numbers. Something like measles is really, really infectious. And what that means is that instead of each old case making about 2 or 3 new cases, each old measles case will make between 15 or 20 new cases. So you can imagine if we tried to draw this out, this slide would be really, really crowded because we'd have a lot of cases. The one other thing that's important to think about here is, you went from 1 case to 3 cases to 9 cases. If each of those 3 cases make 3 new cases, then we're at 27. Each of those 3 cases make new cases. We're going to rapidly increase the number of cases in our population. And this is due to a process that we call exponential growth. So I think probably most of the people here have heard of exponents before. And so what we're seeing is with the disease in a population where everybody, when it's a new disease and people haven't been infected before and there's no immunity, is that 1 to 3 to 9 to 27 really grows quickly. So what I'm showing here is that, after this is 20 cycles of this happening in the population, you have over 500,000 people who are potentially infected with disease. So this disease can spread really quickly. And what I've shown here is what happens when each old case is making 2 new cases on average. What happens if we change that 2 to 3? That's what's shown here. You see that it grows even faster. So we're going, this orange line is showing what would happen if the initial reproduction number was 2. And as we saw in the previous slide, that brought us up to around 500,000 cases. When we have this value equal to 3, over the same amount of time, we're going to have, millions of and billions potentially of cases. And so that's why infectious diseases can be really scary, because if we let them spread in the population and if we don't do anything to prevent their spread, they can grow really quickly and quickly infect a lot of people. And so that's, explains why we do what we do and why we're doing what we're doing right now for COVID, is really to try and prevent this exponential growth. So this is an example of, we talked about the basic reproduction number and how it looks in terms of 1 case making 3 cases, making 9 cases. It turns out that there's a little bit of math behind that number. So, we can talk about, a basic reproductive number of 3, but we can actually go in and calculate the different components that make up that number. So there are 3 pieces to that. One thing that it depends on is how long is a person sick. So if you're sick for a week, or are you sick for a day? That's going to influence what that reproductive number is. The other thing is, how many people does that sick person come into contact with while they're sick? So if you are staying at home and you live alone, you're going to come into contact with nobody. If you are riding on the subway and you are, out and about, you may come into contact with 100 people in the course of a day. And so that's going to influence what that reproductive number is as well. And then the final piece of that, which relates back to math and probabilities, is what is the probability that that sick person infects a healthy person if they do come into contact? So think about the example of the subway. Just say I'm on a subway and there are 100 other people on the subway car with me. If I have a disease that's not very infectious and I really need to come into close contact with somebody, the probability that I infect the other people on the subway car may be really low. So maybe I don't actually infect anybody. Or it may be something like measles, where the probability that you infect people if you come into contact with them is quite high, in which case I may infect 90% of the people on that subway car. So that's, another piece of the component that goes into the R naught. And the reason that it's really important to understand that is, again, to bring this back to COVID and what we're doing right now, is we can use those components of the R naught to understand how do we slow the spread of the disease and how do we reduce the basic reproductive number so that we don't see exponential growth anymore. So here's an example where this initial guy is sick, he infects 3 people, but now he's only infecting 2 people because it turns out that this person is practicing good hygiene, came into contact with this sick person, but didn't get infected because of hand hygiene. Even though they came into contact, he reduced the probability of getting infected. And so in the next generation of cases, because this person didn't get infected, none of these other people get infected either. And so we basically reduced the chain of transmission. This person got infected, but realized that they weren't feeling so good, and so stayed home. And so they stayed home, again, reduced the number of contacts that they had. And so now only infected 1 person instead of infecting 3 people. And so, this is just a little bit of a simple example, but the idea is to think about, what are the components of that basic reproduction number in terms of, how long you're sick, how many people you come into contact with, and probability of transmission per contact. And it's really those components that feed into all of the different public health interventions that we introduce. So whether it be wearing masks, whether it be washing our hands, whether it be staying home, those are all sort of driven by understanding the reproduction number and trying to think about how do we keep it low and ideally, prevent exponential growth. And that's all I wanted to share with you today. And I will stop sharing and happy to take questions, and thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for that presentation. You mentioned you wanted to be a mad scientist. That was exactly my first dream job. So
yeah.
So we open up the chat right now, but before that, I have a few questions that we got ahead of time. So I'll ask you some of those. Okay. So the first question is, what is it like studying mathematics in post-secondary, and how is it different from studying other majors? I know you mentioned you didn't exactly do math, but could you just talk about some of the level of math that you did for your epidemiology?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I didn't study math as a major, and sometimes I regret it because I do wish that I was better at it. I did take calculus and I did take statistics in university, and then in postgraduate work as well. Because I don't think I had a traditional mathematics background, it's hard for me to say, what it would be like to study it as a full-time major. But I will say that, as you do more advanced math, one of the things, especially in terms of statistics and biostatistics, is you start, for me at least, in school, math was, I was good at math and I liked it, but I didn't necessarily understand the point of it, in the sense that you don't, once you start doing really advanced stuff in math, it's not like you ever need to go out and calculate the circumference of a circle. It tends not to be used too much in day-to-day life. But I think one of the things that is interesting when you start doing more advanced math is that you start, and it's specifically if you start studying more applied mathematics, so stuff like probabilities and stats and whatnot, is you really sort of understand how, first of all, how useful it can be, and also how sort of generalizable it is. So the thing that's really nice about mathematical modeling and infectious disease modeling is that people come from really, really diverse fields. So some people have studied mathematics as their background. A lot of people have studied engineering or physics, and it's a little bit of a confluence of all of these different fields, and people are studying different topics, but you can sort of apply these sort of basic concepts from math to all sorts of different areas. And so I mean, I think in hindsight, I wish that I had actually studied more math in university, but you know, I think it can be hard to figure out, you know, exactly where you apply it. And I think a lot of people, you know, have interests in more applied areas, and so it can be hard to sort of strike that balance. But I would encourage you, if you're good at math and you like it, to definitely pursue it, because you never know where you may end up and how it might be used.
Right. Perfect. So you hear that, everyone? Please keep on working on your math. So I'll just jump back and forth here. So I'll go towards one of the questions that we have in the chat. The person asks, have you worked on any of the COVID models?
I have, yes. So I have been working on COVID since January, actually. So early on, I work with a large group of people, but primarily I work with two epidemiologists, one named Amy Greer and one named David Fissman. And we realized early on that it was going to be important to model COVID-19, specifically in Canada. You know, early in February, it became clear that it was likely that this was going to spread and be potentially a pandemic. So we built a model that describes how COVID spreads in specifically in Ontario. And so what we did with that model is we basically did the little emoji model that I shared with you. We built on that a little bit. We added a bit more information to it. We tried to sort of incorporate information on how people interact and how they sort of that human behavior element. And we use that model to try and think about what we should do if COVID came to Ontario.
Mhm.
And we use the model to show that, you know, given that it's a new disease, given that we don't have immunity to it, we showed that it was likely going to infect a large proportion of the population. And so we were thinking about, you know, how do we deal with this? How do we prevent the spread? And we started thinking about how, you know, what sort of public health measures we could introduce. And one of the things that we found was that social distancing or physical distancing was a really, really powerful tool. And so that helped us, you know, sort of recognize how important that was going to be early on to try and prevent spread. And you know, we continue to do modeling, you know, specifically in Canada. Again, thinking about, you know, how do we stop staying at home? You know, how do we get out of this? How do we start returning to life that's a bit more normal? And you know, how do we you know, how do we get out of this? My colleague Amy Greer has been thinking a lot about, you know, summer camps, and so she did work that was, you know, yesterday it was announced that in Ontario there's not going to be overnight summer camps, and she was, you know, involved in using models to think about what would happen if we had summer camps and if, you know, there were outbreaks in summer camps. So there's a lot of uses for models, in, you know, specifically in Canada to try and help us understand what's going on and how do we get back to life as normal.
I'm guessing as we find out even a bit more about how it spreads. So one of the questions is actually asking if it can only spread from touch, or if it spreads via if it can spread via the air. So I'm guessing as we find out more about how it's transmitted, your models will adjust to suit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we know that COVID spreads through droplets. So basically, when you're talking or when you're singing or when you're breathing, is that you're emitting virus, and those virus particles can go into the air, and other people can breathe them in. And so that's part of the reason that we have the physical distancing. So we tell people to stay 2 meters apart from each other. And part of that is because the droplets that you're emitting, if you sort of think of it as like a cloud of viruses that are coming out of your mouth, that 2 meters is thought to be, and you know, there's a lot of science and debate about, you know, what's the right distance, and you know, can they spread farther, and there's something called aerosol, which means that they really sort of get really small particles in the air and that they can spread for long distances. But in general, we think that, around 2 meters is a good distance to keep from each other, so that even if somebody is sick and is spreading disease, it's unlikely that it will reach the person that you're talking to. And that's also part of the reason that people will wear masks, is because it spreads when you're talking, and because a lot of people will not have apparent symptoms, so you can be sick and feel fine. So part of the idea with wearing a mask is that even if you are infected, if you're wearing a mask, you're basically keeping the particles from spreading by wearing a mask.
So I have another question here. So when you're doing your modeling, what platform do you use? So what language do you write in, and how important is coding in your field?
So I use a program called R, which is a stats program. Coding is important. I'm in terms of the things that I'm not really a mathematician. I'm not really a coder. I think as I was talking about, this field is pretty diverse, and you have people with complementary skill sets. So part of the nice thing about where we work is that you do have people who have different skills who can help each other, and so being able to write a model and program is important. But at the end of the day, it's not, depending on the type of model that you're doing. I'm not doing really, really complicated models. Some models are incredibly complicated, and you really need to be a strong programmer. But yeah, there's definitely coding involved, and I wouldn't say that that's necessarily, again, if I could go back in time, in addition to studying more math, I would study computer science and be better at that as well. I think, yeah, because there's that element of that. I think the thing that's really important, though, is that it's not just it's really sort of cross-disciplinary. So people from different areas really need to work together, because you can have somebody who's really good at programming, but doesn't necessarily understand the biology. Or you can have somebody who's really good at math and really good at figuring out how you write the equations, but doesn't really get, the importance of human behavior, and how do we put that into the model. So it really is, it takes a lot of people with different brains and different sort of perspectives and insights to build these sorts of things.
So I'm guessing from a theme here, it seems as though it's very important that people study math, and also collaboration is very important.
Yes, yeah.
Right.
Collaboration is key, because otherwise, you can come up with what you think is a really good idea sort of in your own little bubble, and then you try to, at the end of the day, the stuff that we're doing is we're really interested in helping people and helping understand policies and whatnot. And so, I can come up with a really great idea, but if I tell everybody that they need to, do something that is not feasible or possible, then there's not a huge amount of value in building these models. So sort of having a little bit of a sanity check and talking with other people in different areas is really, really critical.
Nice. So I have another question here. It asks, are there different stages of flattening the curve? If so, what are they, and how do they work?
Okay, that's a really good question, and I think it's something that a lot of people don't realize, is that we talked a lot about flattening the curve as if it was a thing that we did, and once we flattened it, we're done. And the reality is that we did flatten the curve in Canada, but we're not done, because part of the idea of flattening the curve is that you have fewer people who are infected, but that means that a lot of people can still get infected. So as long as there's still coronavirus circulating anywhere in the world, as long as we continue to interact with other people, we're going to have public health measures in place. And so there are definitely different stages. And I think right now we've exited the first stage, or in the middle of exiting the first stage, which has been to the biggest thing that we've done is we've had physical distancing in place. So we've stopped our schools, and people are working from home if they can, and we're minimizing the amount of time that we're spending outside in terms of going to, stores have been shut and whatnot. And we're starting to talk about getting out of that. So then the next stage is going to be, how do we allow ourselves to get outside, to interact with other people, to do shopping if we need to go shopping, while also protecting ourselves, because we still can get infected. We still have disease spreading or circulating in the population. And so, that stage is what that next sort of stage of flattening the curve will look like is going to be different depending on where you live. So I'm in Toronto, and we still have a fair amount of disease. So we have lots of cases still being reported. They're not growing exponentially, which is good. We've really flattened things, but there's still cases happening. And so, we're moving really slowly. We're starting to have, certain stores are opening up. We can have, we're trying to return to normal, but it's not normal yet. There are other places where they don't have a lot of cases anymore, and so they're starting to do things a little bit differently. Some places, I think Hong Kong is opening their schools. I think other countries are starting to sort of let people go to restaurants again. So it's going to be a little bit staged and staggered in terms of what this looks like. And it's also going to be different, depending on where exactly you live. And I think, cities with lots of people and lots of movement and, people riding on subways and buses are probably going to look different than somewhere that's, more rural, where you don't have as many people living, where people are more spaced out. So it's hard to say what exactly that next stage looks like, because it's going to look different everywhere. But basically the idea is to try to return to a sort of more normal existence while keeping disease low. So we did this really sort of extreme thing by telling everyone to stay home. And now we want to say, well, you can start coming out and start doing stuff. But we're watching this, and we're going to keep testing, and we're going to have all of these other interventions in place with the idea of basically keeping activity low.
Okay. So in other words, some of the stages that you mentioned are with the final stage in particular, trying to get that public confidence back. So one of them.
Yeah, and as I think until we have a vaccine, we're probably going to be in some stage of flattening the curve. So there's not really a hard deadline in terms of we do this for 3 months and then everything's back to normal. There's going to be a little bit of a sort of figuring things out and getting confidence back in terms of people feeling safe going out and feeling safe doing their regular life stuff. But I think it's gonna be a while.
Okay. So a few more questions here. So one of our listeners would like to have a bit of a clarification of the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic.
Okay, for sure. So basically, I'll give you an extra definition too. So we start with an outbreak. So an outbreak is basically whenever you have cases that are more than you would expect. So in the case of COVID, because it's a new disease, one case would be considered an outbreak, because until December, we had never heard of it. So one case would be considered an outbreak. In the case of something like flu, we have different measures of how much flu we typically see in our population. And when you go above that normal expected level, then we consider that an outbreak. So an outbreak is unusual disease activity in a sort of limited location. An epidemic is when you have multiple outbreaks. So, something like but it tends to be sort of geographically a little bit restricted. So it might be, an epidemic would be in a country. When you start having epidemics around the world, then it's a pandemic.
Okay.
So in there's a lot of if you want to get like really nerdy, there are people who like spend their lives debating what exactly is a pandemic and when do you define that something is a pandemic. In the case of COVID-19, there was actually a lot of debate around this. So the World Health Organization are the people who are in charge of declaring a pandemic. And for a long time, there were cases of COVID that were happening, around the world, but they didn't call it a pandemic yet. And so there was a lot of question about, why haven't they called it a pandemic yet? And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's a little bit of a hand wavy thing in terms of, there's not a clear definition, like it needs to be in 10 countries and then we call it a pandemic. But it really is just worldwide epidemics of a disease.
So another question here is, what is the probability of someone getting infected to come in contact with an infected person?
For COVID.
For COVID, yeah, sorry, for COVID.
Yeah. So the answer is I don't know. so one of the ways that we figure that out is, remember I showed you the different components of the reproductive number. So we know the number of contacts. If we know the number of contacts, and if we know how long someone is infectious for, and we know in general what the basic reproductive number is, we can rearrange that equation to try and get that probability. So the one thing that is tricky is you have to know how many contacts a person has on average. And that's going to vary from place to place. But you could do the math. And so just say we're going to say that the basic reproductive number is 2. And we'll say that a person is infectious for 5 days. And we'll say that they have 10 contacts a day. That would mean that they would have 2 over 50 would be their probability of transmission per contact. So you can do the math to figure that out, but it's a little bit dependent on your context. So it's really hard to go out and do an experiment and measure that. You could think about how you would do that experiment. Basically, what you would want to do is have somebody who you knew was sick and have them be in a room with somebody who is not sick and expose them to that person, and do that just to 100 people, just say, and count how many people got infected. That would help you estimate that if you wanted to do an experiment. I don't know that anybody would want to do that experiment. I certainly wouldn't want to, but those are the sorts of things that you can do. And you don't need to do it as an experiment. Scientists can go out and look at households, for example, and say, they know that somebody was sick, and they can look at the other people who live in the house with them and figure out how many of those people got infected. And that can help them figure out what that probability of transmission is per contact.
Okay. So I like your initial answer. Like you can't just assume a number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's sort of the general sort of theme with all of this is that, we have sort of averages and generalizations that we can make. But once you start digging a bit deeper, there's always all of these, well, you have to consider this or you have to consider that. And so it tends to be a little bit dependent on context.
Okay, so just the last final few questions here. So one of the questions is centers around vaccines, because it's something that you mentioned. Okay, we won't, everything won't be perfectly settled until we have a vaccine. All right, is there any news of when one would potentially be there or anything?
At this point, we don't know. So there are a couple of what are called vaccine candidates. So people have identified basically vaccine that they think may provide protection, but the challenge is they need to test those. So there are a couple of these candidates that are basically in trials. So they're starting to do experiments in humans just to see if you immunize someone, if they have an immune response, and eventually they need to figure out if that immune response is enough to protect them from getting infected. At this point, it's really early days. The one thing that's been really interesting is that because having a vaccine is so important, and we realize, if we had one, it would be a game changer. It would make everything a lot easier, is that there's been a lot of investment in getting vaccines into trials. And also there's been a lot of effort on and making sure that if or when they have a vaccine candidate, that it can get produced really quickly. So one of the things that is challenging with a vaccine is that you do not only need to have something that works and protects us, but you also need to make it, and you need to make enough of it so that you can give it to everybody who needs it. And then you need to distribute that around the world. So there's a lot of time that goes from, once you have something that is a good immunizing agent, it's still a fair amount of time until that becomes something that, we can start putting into people's arms. And so typically it takes a really, really long time to make a vaccine. I think, of the order of like decades. In the case of COVID-19, there's a huge effort to make this go as quickly as possible. And there's a lot of people working really, really hard to think about all of the different parts of the process. So I think that, most people say that, a year to 18 months would be optimistic in terms of the time till we have a vaccine. But again, at this point, we don't actually know that we have a vaccine candidate that works. So that's probably the biggest unknown. But I think, in the next month or two, we'll start having data from these experiments that are happening in these trials. But yeah, it's optimistically a year or a year and a half.
Okay, perfect. So I have two final questions right now. The first one is just people want a bit of clarification on exactly what the masks do. So does it protect the person wearing it, or does it protect the people who around that individual?
So if you want to make people angry who work in medicine, ask them about masks and what they do, because there's a lot of debate and a lot of controversy. Our current sort of best guess of this is that it mostly protects if you are infectious. So, and you are the person who's, potentially infecting other people. We think that the masks primarily work by protecting you from spreading the virus to other people. The other question is, if I'm not sick but I'm wearing a mask, does it also protect me from breathing in the virus particles? The data around that are less clear. Really sort of our understanding of it is that, if you think about it from just, you don't need to be a scientist, but, if you sort of think about it, if you have something over your mouth and it's protecting you, it can't be a bad thing. I think part of the concern around masks is that sometimes when people are wearing masks, they're not necessarily wearing them properly, or they're touching their face a lot because they think that they're protected. So I think some of the controversy around masks and how they protect you relates less to the mask themselves and more around to like humans and behavior. And, you sometimes see people wearing a mask like on their chin or something, or, they take it on and off. And so there's that component to it. But really, I think the idea is that the main reason that sort of in sort of the general population, why we wear masks is because you can be infectious and not know that you're sick, is that it basically protects those around you in case you are emitting the virus particles.
Okay, perfect. And the final question is, what is the most interesting disease that you've ever modeled?
So I actually really I think cholera is a really interesting disease. And the reason that I think it's interesting is part of the reason that I think infectious diseases are interesting in general, is, it's a disease that's been around for a while. I did a lot of work a while ago on cholera. So cholera is a disease that is, spread basically in poop. So if you get contaminated water, it can get into, people can drink contaminated water and get sick. So we call that fecal oral transmission. Cholera has been around for a long time, and in the 1800s caused some really, really large pandemics, similar to COVID. And the thing that's interesting about cholera is that was before we really understood infectious diseases and how they spread. And so there was a lot of talk about how cholera would spread in the air. And so we would talk about something called the miasma, which was basically like bad air. And that's what caused cholera. And cholera was also associated with poverty. So people who lived in poorer neighborhoods tended to get cholera more. And, now, because we understand sort of how diseases spread and the fact that it was getting into water, and people who were living in poor neighborhoods, tended to live, downstream of sewers, and, we basically didn't have toilets and sanitation. So now we sort of understand why there was that association. But, in the olden days, there was so much judgment and sort of this very sort of, good people didn't get cholera, but, the bad people did get cholera. And there's really weird stuff around, like, sort of people trying to understand who got cholera. And one of my favorite things was there was a priest who was writing to his friend in relation to a cholera outbreak that was happening in North America, and saying that he noticed that the people who were getting cholera were eating a lot of cucumbers. And so there's this sense of, people want to sort of, they tend to be a little bit judgy with infectious diseases. I think, we tend to blame people, or we want to understand, like, why did they get that? They weren't washing their hands properly, or they weren't, and, we see that today with the masks, where, well, people are, the healthcare workers aren't wearing their masks correctly or something. So I think, cholera is an old disease, but a lot of the stuff that we see in terms of our understanding of it and how we respond to it, and how, as humans, we tend to want to have explanations for it, and we tend to be a little bit judgy about it, I think is really interesting. And I think, there are parallels to COVID-19 in terms of, we tend to not be the most empathetic in terms of when people get infected, and thinking about, risk factors and why they got infected.
That's very interesting about considering if people ate cucumbers, they'll get it. That's very fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, and with that, I would like to thank you very much for presenting here and informing us a lot more about the COVID situation. Do you have any final words for all our listeners today?
No, I just want to say thank you very much for your fantastic questions. I hope you learned something, and keep studying your math.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a great day, and like Dr. Ashleigh said, keep studying your math. I'm going to copy that phrase. I like that one.
Thank you.